to our weekly Irish Studies seminar. And today's speaker is Colin Armstrong, known to many people in the room. Colin has researched and written widely on British and Irish history in the 16th and 17th century principally, and is currently working on a project on Jeremy Taylor, but he's also stretching his interest into the 19th century. With respect to Edward Hincks of Killyleagh, and that's what he's going to speak to us about today. I should say he's an independent scholar and a visiting researcher here at the Institute of Irish Studies at Queen's. And he's going to speak to us today on scholarship and controversy in the 19th century Church of Ireland, Edward Hincks of Killyleagh, 1792 to 1866. So, Colin, over to you.
Edward Hincks was rector of Killyleagh, County Down, from 1825 to 1866. Over the last 30 or so years of his life, he made many major contributions to the study of the languages of ancient Egypt and Assyria. In both fields, the latter especially, he was a pioneer. One modern Egyptologist, John Ray, has written that impressive is the right word for Hincks's achievements. Of a second generation, his interest in the subject has an Irish dimension, as he was present at the unwrapping of Takabuti, the Belfast mummy, in the Old Belfast Museum in 1835, and translated the inscription on the mummy case. He also translated an inscription on a mummy case owned by Lord Dufferin, though that has long since left Llandy-boy. By the 1840s, Hincks has added Assyriology to his interests. Here perhaps he was even more of a pioneer. In 1846, he wrote for the Dublin University magazine about Henry Rawlinson's work in the decipherment of cuneiform. Although Rawlinson was the first to translate extended passages of Old Persian, Professor Kevin Cathcart, the principal authority on Hincks's scholarship, judges him to have been the superior linguist. Peter Daniels has written of Hincks that it is he, and nearly he alone, who made it possible to read once again the memorials of the world's first civilization. Who was this prodigious scholar? Hincks was born in 1792, the son of the Reverend Thomas Dix Hincks, a Presbyterian minister of Arian or non-Trinitarian views. Thomas Dix, though born in Ireland, was of English parentage. His wife, too, was English. The novelist Elizabeth Gaskell was a cousin. Two of Hincks's brothers became Unitarian ministers. One, William, later became professor of natural history at Toronto, a position for which he was preferred over Thomas Huxley. Another brother, Francis, rose to become joint Prime Minister of Canada in the 1850s, after the union of Upper and Lower Canada. He later turned to the colonial service as a governor before returning to Canada after Confederation as Federal Minister of Finance. Thomas Dix taught in Cork and founded the Cork Institution. In 1822, he moved to Belfast as headmaster of the classical school at the Belfast Academical Institution, a body of which his son was later to become a vice president, and professor of Oriental languages in the collegiate department. He attended the First Presbyterian Church in Rosemary Street, where the minister, William Bruce, was a leading Arian. Henry Cooke, the champion of Trinitarianism and Irish Presbyterianism, both before and after the schism of 1829, called the institution a seminar of Arianism. Thomas Dix Hincks was one of the teachers there who were denounced by Cooke in a letter of 1825 to Sir Robert Peel. But Samuel Hannah, another Trinitarian Presbyterian, testified to a Commons committee that Thomas Dix Hincks did not allow his views to affect his teaching. Hincks himself claimed that he confined his curriculum to Hebrew grammar. Edward Hincks was educated first by his father and then at Middleton College in Cork. Thomas Dix, before going to a dissenting academy in Hackney, had matriculated at Trinity College Dublin, and Edward Hincks followed him to the latter establishment, becoming an undergraduate at 15. He was elected a scholar in 1810, and it must have been around this time that he conformed to the established church. His younger brother Thomas was also to become an Anglican clergyman and Archdeacon of Connor, and became Archdeacon of Connor in 1865. In the 19th century, theological differences could lead to personal estrangement, but Hincks seems to have remained in close touch with his father. No correspondence survives between them, but both of his parents were buried at Killyleagh. In 1838, Thomas Dix Hincks wrote to William Bruce about Edward's finances and his daughter-in-law's poor health. He mentioned also that he'd spent 7 weeks with Thomas Jr. in his Northampton parish. In 1857, writing to William Henry Fox Talbot, a fellow Assyriologist as well as a photographer, Edward Hincks referred to his elderly father, then in the last year of his life, as the chief tie which binds me to Ireland. There is some evidence that that Edward Hincks was estranged from William, his Unitarian brother, who wrote in 1822 that they were out of touch, but they were back in contact by 1840. Conforming to the Church of Ireland opened up to Edward Hincks a route to both academic and ecclesiastical preferment, but it need not be supposed that he acted out of opportunism rather than conviction. In 1828, Hincks, by then at Killyleagh, took part with 2 other clergymen of the Church of Ireland in a debate in Downpatrick with 3 Catholic priests. At one point in this debate, he declared, "We hold the Orthodox faith respecting the person of Jesus Christ as defined by the First Councils and embodied in the Athanasian Creed." 20 years later, in a review for the Dublin University magazine, he criticised one author for his Socinian, that is, Unitarian, bias. In 1812, at the age of 20, Hincks became a Fellow of Trinity. This opened the way to ministry in the church. He was made a deacon in 1815 and ordained a priest in 1817. In September 1819, he became the rector of Ardtray, County Tyrone, in the Diocese of Armagh, and college living. His move to parish life was probably not because he wanted to marry at that point. His wedding did not take place until February 1822. It may well be that he chose to leave Trinity because he wanted more time for scholarship. R.B. MacDowell and D.A. Webb, the historians of Trinity, note that the tutorial duties of the junior fellows at that time impeded their research. They note that both Hincks and Thomas Romney Robinson, the astronomer, both made their own major academic contributions after leaving Dublin. Another reason for his decision to go to Ardtray may be that he enjoyed poor relations with the then Provost Thomas Elrington, himself a former rector of Ardtray. In his diary, Hincks noted of the meeting at which he was appointed to the living, "The Provost took care to be absent." In 1825, Hincks moved to another college living, Killyleagh. There he was closer to his parents, by now in Belfast. Both parishes were wealthy, in theory at least. Ardtray was valued at 800 a year, Killyleagh at 795. But Hincks, having compounded his tithe income under the Goulburn Act, was to see over time a considerable reduction in his income. By the last year of his life, 1866, Killyleagh brought him £550 a year. His income was to be a subject of complaint and worry for most of his latter years of his life. It was in Killyleagh that Hincks was to make his major contributions to scholarship. But he, and at least some of his contemporaries, recognized that his erudition had a purpose. The 19th century was an age in which religious orthodoxy was under attack. Hincks was orthodox in his religious beliefs. In a letter to his father in December 1829, he wrote of his new interest in Egyptology, but he also suggested that he might write a history of the church up to the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD, and the 4th and 5th centuries were the age of controversy of Trinitarian and Christological doctrine. In his work on both subjects, Assyriology, he expressed a hope, this is to his Unitarian father, that his position in the Church of Ireland would be considered a sufficient warrant that the cause of revealed religion would be sustained in both these treatises, though he also wrote that he wished to observe a strict neutrality as to the points of controversy. In October 1842, he wrote to Robert Peel, the Prime Minister, to ask for a pension to fund his research, a request which was to be declined. In his letter, Hincks argued that his work might be of the greatest service to the cause of Christianity as illustration of biblical history and of biblical language. 11 years later, Thomas Romney Robinson, a clergyman and then the director of Armagh Observatory, wrote to commend Hincks to Charles Blomfield, the Bishop of London. He argued that the highest places in the new discipline of Assyriology should be occupied by Christians. Even now there are signs that infidelity will lay hold, if it can, on the Assyrian history. In a sermon on the Sunday after his brother's death in 1866, Thomas Hincks told the parishioners of Killyleagh that the deceased had declared again and again that no discoveries he ever made threw the slightest discredit upon the facts recorded in the Holy Scriptures, but on the contrary, all tended to confirm this sacred record. Hincks never wrote any systematic treatise on this Egyptology and Assyriology. His work took the form of numerous articles and reviews. But in those writings, traces can be found of Hincks's conservative attitude to the historicity of the Old Testament. In an article of 1838 for the Transactions of the Royal Irish Academy and the years and cycles used by the ancient Egyptians, he concluded by expressing a hope that important points of chronology could be established in perfect consistency with divine revelation. In a review of 1848 for the Dublin University magazine, he wrote that important points of chronology could be had only from divine revelation. And while in the same review he criticized the overdrawn statements commonly made at popular meetings respecting the Bible, statements which are not warranted by anything in the Bible itself, he also expressed surprise that the Baron von Bunsen, the liberal biblical critic and Prussian ambassador to London, had been invited to address the Evangelical Alliance. He noted approvingly that the invitation had been criticized by Edward Pusey, not only the leader of Tractarianism, but also the Regius Professor of Hebrew at Oxford. In another of his contributions to the Transactions of the Royal Irish Academy in 1843, Hincks argued that the believers in divine revelation might be encouraged to pursue Egyptology so that they might serve as a check to the vain fancies of unbelievers. He also believed that the Assyrian inscriptions could be used to support the historical reliability of the Bible. He criticized his rival Assyriologist, Henry Rawlinson, in 1856 for his interpretation of an inscription regarding Nebuchadnezzar on account of the discredit which must attach to the book of Daniel if the view which he has put forward be accepted. In defending Daniel as he did, Hincks held a position which was still common in English scholarship. Another supporter of the book's historical reliability was Pusey. Where Hincks found errors in the Old Testament, he tried to account for them by alleging mistakes in transcription. On at least one occasion, he also showed concern for the historicity of the New Testament, as well as the Old. In June 1856, he wrote to his fellow Assyriologist, the politician and diplomat Henry Layard, regarding a mutilated section of a manuscript of Tacitus in Florence. He wrote, "The object of the mutilator was, according to my view of the matter, to destroy the testimony of Tacitus regarding our Lord's ministry and death. Whether this was done by an enemy or a misjudging friend must remain a question." What sort of clergyman was Hincks? That is, where was he situated in party terms in 19th century Anglicanism? He noted that his act sermon for the Trinity Bachelor of Divinity degree was regarded by some to be evangelical, And in more recent years, Alan Atchison has made the same claim about Hincks's churchmanship. Another sermon of the 1820s suggests rather that Hincks was an old-fashioned high churchman, one attached to his church's episcopal ministry and its liturgy and formularies. In the first 3 or so decades of the 19th century, the pre-Tractarian high churchmen dominated the higher reaches of the hierarchy, both in the Church of England and the Church of Ireland. In England, this was the age of Charles Manners Sutton and William Harley in Canterbury. In Ireland, of William Stewart and Lord John George Beresford at Armagh, and William Magee in Dublin, high churchmen all. Hincks's sermon of 1821 was delivered in Armagh Cathedral in September at a visitation of his diocese by the then primate William Stewart. The context of the sermon was a recent withdrawal from the Hibernian Bible Society of both Stewart and his successor at Armagh, Beresford of Dublin. Both prelates saw the society as pan-Protestant. In becoming Bible distributors, they've forgotten they were churchmen, was how they put the matter. In his sermon, Hincks said that any Anglican clergyman who attended meetings of the various Bible societies couldn't do so without having his attachment to everything belonging to that church gradually undermined. The societies were led by sectaries intermingled with those who, though adhering to the church and supported by its revenues, cherished the principles of sectaries. He condemned those clergy who allowed ministers of other denominations to preach from their pulpits, evincing by the conduct the little stress which they must place upon episcopal ordination and government. Furthermore, he regarded as radically erroneous the Bible Society's principle that the Bible alone, unaccompanied by note or comment, creed or articles of faith, is a sufficient means of grace to put into the possession of everyone. The belief that the Bible ought to be read in conjunction with the books of the church, the prayer book, etc., was a common one among high churchmen. For example, Herbert Marsh, later the Bishop of Llandaff and later still of Peterborough, wrote in 1816 of the English Bible Society, "Take away the prayer book, and though we remain Protestants, we become dissenters." Hincks's continuing concern with the importance of the church's teaching can be seen again 30 years later when he wrote in June 1852 about his plans to spend time in London working on Assyrian inscriptions. His bishop, Robert Bent Knox, was willing to allow him to be non-resident for a period, but insisted on nominating the curate who would be in charge during his absence. Hincks would not countenance this. He wanted to choose his own substitute, as one appointed by Knox might give instructions to my parishioners of a different character from what I've given and what I believe to be in accordance with the articles and liturgy of the church. Although his high churchmanship was of the pre-Tractarian variety, he did show some interest, sympathy even, in the Oxford movement. In 1847, he wrote to his daughters from Oxford, where he was attending the British Association. He noted that he'd made a particular point of visiting Oriel College on account of the eminent men who've been fellows there. Those sometimes fellows included not only Hincks's then Bishop Richard Mant and Richard Whately, the Archbishop of Dublin, but also the four leaders of Tractarianism: Newman, who'd converted to Catholicism 2 years before, Pusey, John Keble, and the only one who was at that stage dead, Richard Hurrell Froude. In 1850, Hincks read the poetical collection Lyra Apostolica and noted in his diary, "If Newman be the author of the poems signed Delta, I should regret his fall more than I've ever yet done." As will be seen later, accusations of Puseyism would be made against Hincks himself. Why did a clergyman of Hincks's unquestionable eminence as a scholar and unimpeachable orthodoxy not rise further in the Church of Ireland? Hincks himself thought that he had the answer. In his letter to Peel in 1842, he stated that for 25 years and more, he had been the unchanging advocate of two great principles: which, though avowedly acted upon by your present government here, in Ireland at least, nevertheless placed him in opposition to your party. I allude to the isopolity of all religious classes of my countrymen, isopolity being a type of polity in which views are not necessarily uniform, and the freedom of education from compulsory religious instruction. In such principles, he believed, had earned him the ill will of influential persons in the church and state, whose advice would be looked to in the disposing of church preferments. 22 years later, he wrote to Layard, himself a sometime MP, to complain that the better off clergy were often Tories and have been promoted by liberal bishops for illiberality. I alone, who have always taken the liberal side, have been in my old position, with an income 2/3 of what I began my life with. Hincks was indeed a liberal and an opponent of Protestant ascendancy, despite his high churchmanship. In 1840, he wrote to the Reverend R.W. Kyle, who'd been one of his fellow participants in the 1828 debate. Hincks was exercised because it was being put about that at the time of that disputation, he had opposed emancipation, changing his mind only later. Kyle replied, "You were throughout a decided Whig and a strenuous advocate of what you thought the justice, expediency, and Christian duty of extending to our Romish fellow subjects the same privileges which Protestants enjoyed." Hincks's political liberalism can be traced in other ways. In a sermon, "Peace to All Men," preached in the chapel at Dublin Castle early in 1840, his tone was very political. The peace of Ireland, he declared, depended upon the contest between two parties. So far as England was concerned, Peel would act on liberal principles, and it would be his wish and his endeavour to do the same in Ireland. But he said such an attempt would be hopeless. In Ireland, Peel would rule through the ascendancy party, and in the manner that would please him. The consequences, oppression, and possibly civil war produced by a persistence in it are frightful to contemplate. He went on to refer to a principle without the practical recognition of which it is absolutely impossible that peace should exist among educated people. I mean the principle that a man's rights are not to be forfeited in consequence of his religious opinions, that he's not to be deprived of worldly advancement to which he might otherwise lay claim because he belongs to a church that the dominant party in the state may denounce as unchristian. Now, it is little more than 10 years since the legislature of this country first recognized this principle in theory. It's not the half of that time since the executive government first fully recognized it in practice. And there are even yet remaining, though happily their days may be numbered, there are, however, yet remaining in many of our principal cities, subordinate institutions which not only reject this principle as the rule of their own conduct, but afford countenance and support to those fanatics who indulge the idle dream that the exclusive system on which they are yet still permitted to act in their own petty spheres will once more be established in the nation. He went on to thank God that the administration of the government is yet in the hands of those by whom pacific counsels are cherished. By 1840, Hincks was involved with William Sharman Crawford's Ulster Constitutional Association, and especially in opposition to Stanley's Irish Registration Bill of 1840, a proposed measure Crawford regarded as leading to the disenfranchisement of the honest independent voter. Hincks proposed a resolution at an association meeting in October 1840, claiming that Stanley's bill would swindle out of their franchise the great body of the bona fide electors. In an open letter to Sharman Crawford of February 1841, he called the bill a measure more fraught with mischief than any other which has been introduced into Parliament for many years. And in 1849, Hincks refused to sign a petition after Lord Roden's dismissal from the Commission of the Peace following the violent confrontation at Dolly's Bray. Hincks's political liberalism is clear, but there's an obvious difficulty with his belief that it was this which was the cause of his exclusion from ecclesiastical preferment. During the last 36 years of his life, Whig Liberal administrations were in office for more than 2/3 of the time. Indeed, efforts to promote Hincks while the Whigs were in power did not succeed. R.J. Tennant, the Liberal MP for Belfast, wrote in 1848 to W.J.C. Allen, the Register of the Queen's College, Belfast, that he hoped that he could work Hincks up into a bishop. This was when Lord John Russell was Prime Minister. In the 1850s, Hincks wrote to Laird that he'd applied for the deanery of Armagh and had asked Hincks to write to Russell on his behalf. Yet again, he was disappointed. In December 1851, he wrote to the Whig Lord Lieutenant, Lord Clarendon, to ask if he might be considered for the vacant provostship of Trinity, Dublin. He wrote in a letter that his liberal principles on education were well known and suggested that if he were to be appointed to the provostship, he might also become a Commissioner of National Education. The provost appointed, Richard MacDonald, was, like his predecessor, Frank Sadler, a man with views acceptable to the Whigs. 5 years later, another appointment Hincks hoped for, the deanery of Down, again went to someone else. Hincks told Laird that Knox, the Bishop of Down, one of whom Hincks wrote with a certain hostility, wanted the position for his brother, while Lord Dufferin hoped it would go to his uncle. The candidate appointed, Thomas Woodward, was the grandson of the Bishop of Cloyne. So what prevented Hincks's elevation? One reason might be that he never had patrons of sufficient eminence or power. Tennant never held an office. Laird was an under-secretary in the 1850s and 1860s. But any efforts he may or may not have made did not succeed. Hincks thanked Dufferin in 1855 for introducing him to Carlisle, the then Lord Lieutenant, but again, nothing came of that. I think it was Tennant who saw the real reason behind Hincks's failure to be promoted. Writing to Allen in 1848, he observed, "A suspected tinge of Puseyism is Dr. Hincks's greatest difficulty, Lord John and co. being strongly contra." No doubt this is why when Tennant wrote to Russell on Hincks's behalf, he claimed that Hincks was not identified with any extreme party in the church. The apparent contradiction of Hincks's situation as a high churchman who was an illiberal in politics is well illustrated in his contribution to the debate on Irish education. As Chief Secretary, Edward Stanley had established a national system for Ireland in 1831. The limited form of religious education the system allowed, a volume of scripture extracts, allowed initially the hostility of all the main churches. The Catholic and Presbyterians soon worked out compromises with the system, but most clergy and laity of the established church, Richard Whately being the leading exception, remained hostile. The Church of Ireland formed its own education society and sought, unsuccessfully as it proved, state support. In an open letter to Peel, who supported the national system in 1844, Richard Mant, Hincks's own diocesan ordinary as Bishop of Down, stated that the only persons in Ireland thrown upon their own unassisted resources for the education of the poor are the members of the United Church of England and Ireland, and that the only cause of their being precluded from public assistance is their faithful attachment to the principles and injunctions of the Church. May God forgive you, sir, this wrong. In another open letter to Peel, Beresford of Armagh asked if the prepositions in favour of making the inspired volume the basis of education are to meet with no sympathy or encouragement. Peel stayed firm in his support of what he called mixed education. Hincks too was a supporter of national education from the late 1830s on, but not quite for the reasons given by Peel. Like Mance and Beresford, Hincks objected to the scripture extracts volume, but he was satisfied that the compulsion to attend instruction in it there was no compulsion to attend religious instruction from the late 1830s onwards. He clashed on this subject with Thomas Drew in 1840. Drew called Hincks a railer against the scriptures for his objections to the use of the Bible as a means of teaching children to read. Hincks responded that Drew and Hugh MacNeill, another evangelical, attributed to the mechanical task of reading the Bible what would be denounced as Puseyism to attribute to the sacraments of the church. Hinks's longest contribution to this controversy, a pamphlet of 1844, displayed his scorn for what he regarded as the wrong-headed views on the subject. He wrote this work had been written some years before, but had been set aside under the conviction that the prejudices of the clergy were at that time too strong to be overcome by argument. The matter had been treated in a clarity rather than an argumentative fashion. Advocates of the Church Education Society, he noted, allowed that dissenters might be excused distinctively church education, but not the daily reading of the Bible. The case for this had been made at public meetings, to be met with applause from the unreflecting multitude with whose prejudices it is in accordance. The Church Education Society's proponents were holding out not for any church object, but an ultra-Protestant position. Placing schools run by the Church Education Society under the National Board would not deprive them of their character as church schools or cause them to lose the right to provide religious instruction to Church of Ireland children. But Hincks was not pursuing his case on liberal principles. On the contrary, he was worried that the compulsory reading of the Bible with only optional instruction in church teaching was unchurchmanlike and latitudinarian. His justification of the national system was in line with his attack on the Bible societies 20 years before. This was not a line of argument which would have commended itself to many of the system's other supporters. Hincks intervened in other controversies relating to the Church of Ireland. In 1860 and 61, he engaged in correspondence, eventually published, with another clergyman, Alfred Lee, on the question of the proposed revival of the Irish Convocation of Clergy, a body which had been dormant since the reign of Queen Anne, as had its English counterparts, but they had been restored in the 1850s. Contrary to Lee's support for a revived convocation, Hincks argued that the summoning of convocation would require a new Act of Parliament. And just a year before his death, Hincks wrote to the Times in November 1865 to outline a scheme of reform for the Church of Ireland, which he thought would strengthen establishment. But he regarded the church as being over-officered, expensively officered, and with all this, most inefficiently officered. He proposed that the number of dioceses, which had already been reduced in the 1830s from 22 to 12, should be further reduced to 8. That there should be only one archbishop, Dublin be demoted to a bishopric, and that the number of other dignitaries should also be reduced. Given Hincks's own disappointed ambitions, it may have pleased him to suggest that the total income of the bishops should be decreased by more than half, from 55,000 a year to 26,000. For much of his time at Killyleagh, Hincks had been exercised by the decrease in his income. Financial constraints, in his mind at least, had hampered his researches. Though he went too far perhaps when he wrote to Layard in 1852 that if I live 3 years more, he lived 16, I shall die one of the poorest men in this country. His worries may not have been entirely illusory. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography states that his will was proved at under 3,000. He seems to have had insurance policies used as securities for loans, and this may have reduced his estate. After his death, his 3 unmarried daughters were given a state pension of £100 a year, a scheme supported by Dufferin and Layard. The penultimate decade of Hincks's life, the 1850s, saw his involvement in yet other controversies which affected him directly. These involved objections to ritual in the Church of Ireland and Hincks's own high churchmanship, relations with Presbyterians in Killyleagh, and at the end of the decade, in 1859, his opposition to the 1859 revival. Throughout the whole United Church of England and Ireland, the mid-19th century witnessed controversy over the Oxford movement. The old-fashioned high churchmen had initially welcomed the movement led by Pusey and Newman, but relations worsened in the 1830s as the Tractarians began to express views on matters of doctrine and church history, which our more cautious fellows could not countenance. Controversy reached even the diocese of Down and Connor under Mant. Mant was an old-fashioned high churchman, a protege of 2 successive Archbishop of Canterbury, Manus, Sutton and Holy. He'd also defended baptismal regeneration and attacked Calvinism in his Bampton lectures of 1812 at Oxford. Like so many of the old high churchmen, he was also involved in controversy with Catholicism as well as with dissenters and evangelicals. In Peter Knockel's words, for his party, Protestant and Catholic were not mutually exclusive terms. In his first diocese in Ireland, Killyleagh, Mant had caused controversy and created personal difficulties for himself by an episcopal charge which a fellow bishop, Jeb of Limerick, described as breathing theological warfare against the papists. In his Ulster diocese, he wrote that the Presbyterians were not very hostile to the established church when he arrived, but he soon had cause to rebuke one of his own clergymen who at a service Mant himself had attended had given notice of a sermon to be preached in a local Presbyterian church the following Sunday. In his primary charge to his new diocese of Down and Connor, Mant referred to Jeremy Taylor, the chief persecutor of the Presbyterians in Restoration Ulster, as the most illustrious of his predecessors. Not long after, he erected a monument to Taylor in Lisbon Cathedral. He showed how even-handed he could be in his anti-ecumenism by voting against emancipation in the Lords. His 2 sons, or 2 of his sons, Walter and Frederick, both incumbents in their father's diocese, had both known Newman at Oxford, where Walter was Newman's Oxford Oriel pupil, and the other, Frederick, was a guest on a number of occasions in Newman's rooms in the college. Mant was one of the many bishops who condemned Newman's Tract 90 in 1841-42. Tract 90 had been Newman's attempt to reconcile the 39 articles of Anglicanism with Catholicism, particularly in the teachings of the doctrines or decrees of the Council of Trent. That expression of Mant's Protestantism did not, as we know from the work of Sean Farrell and the late Nigel Yates, save Mant from controversy over the Down and Connor Architecture Society or involvement in disputes over ritual in the parishes of Hillsborough and Hincks, where the respective incumbents were his sons Walter and Frederick, as well as controversies in other parishes, particularly one, Kilmore, where Mant's chief opponent was James Sharman Crawford. In the last case, Kilmore, Mant demonstrated that he believed in working according to the church's rubrics. Perhaps it was fear of the imputation of Puseyism in this case that led him to declare that the Book of Common Prayer had been given for the safeguard of Protestantism against future inroads of popery. Controversy over Puseyism continued into the next decade. Lord John Russell's letter to the Bishop of Durham in 1850 on the restoration of the Catholic hierarchy in England by Pius IX and Archbishop Wiseman was in fact directed as much against the Tractarian enemy within as the Catholic external foe. And despite Mant's death in 1848, such disputes continued in at least one part of his former diocese, Killyleagh. Hincks's own relationship with Mant, so far as we can tell, was not always a good one. When Lord Morpeth, then Chief Secretary, sought to appropriate surplus income of the Church of Ireland for secular uses in 1835, Mant circulated a petition among his clergy alleging that the consequences would be the immediate extermination of the worship and the members of the United Church of England and Ireland from a large number of parishes in this country. This Hincks denied in a letter in the Morning Register, though he allowed that Morpeth's bill would reduce clerical incomes and the money of current incumbents. Hincks saw as a vested right. But he saw that no trust had been vested in the clergy to prevent appropriation when our own incumbencies are over. He added that the trembled for the consequences if the Lords rejected again a tithe bill. Mant wrote that he'd been told that the letter, which he'd not seen, was impertinent and weak. In a second letter to Mant, published in the Northern Whig in October 1835, Hincks accused Beresford of Armagh of having, during the passage of Morpeth's bill, placed the temporal interests of the clergy under the protection of a party in Parliament, and in using arguments in their behalf that were addressed altogether to the feelings and prejudices of that party in place of those which might have been addressed to the justice of the entire body. But in matters theological and liturgical, Hincks was closer to Mant, as disputes in his own parish were to show. In November 1853, the Banner of Ulster reported on a commotion in Killyleagh, alleging that Hincks's curate, after the Puseyite fashion of his country, the curate was an Englishman, had worn an academic hood, and then Hincks himself had worn a red hood, that is of his DD, Doctor of Divinity. The Banner claimed that the parishioners protested against what they considered popish innovations and left the church. After a Presbyterian ministerial student, Alexander Field, had lectured in Killyleagh's courthouse on the Puritans of England, certain persons broke into the vestry of the church and cut the hood in half. This is a newsletter called The Malignant Libels of an Agitating Leaguer, printed in the League Utensil, the Banner of Ulster. There was no popery or Puseyism, the newsletter went on, in collegiate hoods. No more popery and Puseyism, the newsletter went on, in collegiate hoods than in a Geneva gown or the Muslim bands of the Presbyterian minister. The Downpatrick Recorder, which clearly disapproved of Mant's conduct in the previous decade, chided Hincks for wearing the hood. No wise man will ever run counter to the prejudices of his people. If the wearing of a scarlet hood had afforded merriment to the dissenters of a whole neighbourhood, so that the church is turned into ridicule, it ought not to be worn. Hincks replied in the paper that he'd acquired the hood in the expectation that if he officiated in London during a period researching there, he would be expected to wear one. The agitation he blamed on the Presbyterians, who'd organised lectures in the summer on popery and prelacy, during which the church had been held up to ridicule and contempt. He claimed to have the sympathy of most of his parishioners. The Banner of Ulster, in its response, acknowledged the liberality of Hincks's principles in politics, but denied that the Presbyterians were to blame for the disaffection existing among the Episcopalian people of Killyleagh. The paper went on to allege that in parts of Down, Presbyterians were being induced to become Anglicans by means comparable to superism. Alexander Breaky, one of the two Presbyterian ministers of Killyleagh, alleged that the lectures had not held up the Church of Ireland to ridicule. He went on to accuse Hincks of preaching that characteristic high church doctrine of apostolic succession, making his own exclusively the church and unchurching his Presbyterian neighbours. The Downpatrick Recorder's editor claimed that the root of the disharmony between the dissenters and Anglicans of the town was the engagement of an English curate, presumably Hinks's, the marriage engagement of an English curate, that's Hinks's, and a local Presbyterian lady. 5 years later, Hincks wrote to the Presbyterian Downpatrick Recorder again to defend himself against accusations by McCreary, the other Presbyterian minister, that he and his curate had been proselytizing. On the contrary, he wrote that McCreary had been preaching against him, but as the result of the attacks, more Presbyterians had joined the Church of Ireland than the other way, and that furthermore his parishioners had become more attached to their liturgy in consequence of the abuse that has been heaped upon it. He denied that Presbyterians had been cajoled into conforming by being confirmed by Bishop Knox. He could not deny himself the right to make ministerial visits to Presbyterian families which had requested them. And then also in October 1858, Woodward, the Dean of Down, who lived in Killyleagh, wrote to Lord Dufferin to complain that McCreary had attacked both Hincks and himself and the church's liturgy, from which no term of gross abuse had been spared. Such is a background to Hincks's opposition to the 1859 revival. The revival was primarily a Presbyterian affair, but the Church of Ireland was not unaffected. Those historians who've commented on the attitude of the Church of Ireland to the revival have portrayed it as being largely positive. But this is to ignore the position of some figures in the Church of Ireland. Was the position of some figures in the Church of Ireland, including two bishops, Singer of Meath and Robert Knox of Down. However, the pamphlet literature on the revival reveals deep-rooted opposition among some Anglicans. To many contemporary observers, the most striking feature of the revival was the physical phenomena, crying, frustrations, and visions. Such features were to some strange and unwelcome, and they attracted criticism from clergy of the Church of Ireland. E.A. Stopford, the Archdeacon of Meath and father of Alice Stopford Green, admitted some good in this movement, but added, "It is Satan and not Christ who has mingled the evil with the good." Christ and the apostles had not used hysteria. He wrote that what he had seen in the Belfast Presbyterian Church, cries and groans and exclamations and amens, all having the true hysteric sound, would not be permitted in any bedlam on earth. William McElwain, the rector of St. George's, compared the revival to Mormonism. George Salmon, later the provost of Trinity, wrote of the physical phenomena, "We have no right to throw people's bodies into an unhealthy state in the hope of saving their souls." Scripture did not warrant the expectation that bodily convulsions, this is in Salmon's view, would accompany conversion, nor could revival be based on miracles. Salmon's Trinity colleague, Thomas MacNeice, the Archbishop King's lecturer in divinity, wrote that the physical phenomena were simply manifestations of nervous derangement brought on by religious excitement. He claimed that factory girls, in consequence of the confinement, hot air, etc., are good subjects for hysteria. Hincks was not least among the revival's critics. The revival began in Mid-Antrim, but soon reached Killyleagh. Robert Workman, later a Presbyterian minister, but then a lay evangelist, arrived in Killyleagh in July. He wrote to his fiancée, "All the Puseyites are greatly against the work of the Lord, but the evangelical part of the church are greatly anxious to forward it." On July the 31st, Hincks preached to a congregation of 240 in his parish church, a sermon later published as God's Work and Satan's Counterwork. Like the revival's other Church of Ireland critics, Hincks allowed that some good had come from it, but his disapproval of physical phenomena, he disapproved of the physical phenomena and did not think them miraculous. It is sad to think how successful Satan has been in propagating this shocking delusion. How much evil is done every day under the belief that it is good. Physicians were agreed, he asserted, that nothing had occurred which could not be explained by natural causes. Some revivalists were using tricks to induce hysteria, he claimed. The two Presbyterian clergy of Killyleagh, Alexander McCreary and Andrew Breaky, Hincks's long-standing critics, replied in anger. McCreary criticised Hincks for his belief in baptismal regeneration and his Arminianism or anti-Calvinism. He also called Hincks an Arian and a tritheist, positions Hincks did not hold, and which were in any case incompatible and contradictory. Breaky claimed that Woodward, the Dean of Down, who lived in Killyleagh, also opposed a revival. He attacked Hincks for low and misplaced ridicule, and he compared him, somewhat implausibly, to the freethinkers Paine and Voltaire. Breaky defended the physical phenomena, and he attacked Hincks, who was teaching on baptism and wearing the surplice in the pulpit. He revived the accusation that Hincks had disturbed the peace of his parish by wearing his doctoral hood. Hincks's career illustrates a number of themes of importance to the 19th century church. He illustrates the church's contributions to learning. He shows that advanced scholarship and a conservative approach to the Old Testament were, in his lifetime at least, compatible. He shows the importance in an Irish context of pre-Tractarian high churchmanship. He shows the continuing antagonism into the middle of the 19th century of Presbyterianism and Anglicanism. And to allude to the work of a novelist who is Hincks's younger contemporary, he shows that to be a Grantley in a religion and a Proudy in politics was not the way to ecclesiastical preferment.
Colin, thank you very much for introducing us to the complex, fascinating, and as you quite clearly demonstrated, important figure of Edward Hincks in the 19th century Church of Ireland. We've got time for questions. We have an audience in the room, quite a large audience in the room, and we have people joining us online through Teams as well. So let me throw it open to the floor. Who would like to ask the first question? Yes, yeah.
Two questions. The first is, do we know that Hincks have expressed any opinions on Darwin?
No.
The second is, did you come into contact with Henry Cook, who was the minister of Killyleagh, and you arrived at, or with William Johnson?
You said Cook in Killyleagh, yes. And then after that, you said something.
William Johnson, who ran a paper called Downshire Policy.
I certainly had no contact with Johnson, of which I'm aware. He attacked Cook and then mocked Drew who had been close to Cook, he said, on education. He mocked Drew after Cook accepted the National Board's supervision of Presbyterian schools. He was also present at the meeting in the early to mid-1830s at which Cook presided in education. I think that this was at the stage when Hincks was still hostile to the national system, but he moved towards acceptance of it in the 1830s. That's all I know at present of Hincks's attitude to Cook. I haven't yet looked at Porter. I've only read Finlay Holmes at present on Cook. and he doesn't really go into any contact between Hincks and Cook. I wonder if there's anything in Porter, but I've yet to look at that book.
Other questions? Yes, Sean.
Fascinating account. I mean, this sounds like a man who started fighting in an empty phone box in some ways.
Yes, yeah.
Often the controversies. Is there any element of cultural conflict here between the South and North? Somebody whose background is in the rather different religious environment of Southern Irish Protestantism, much of an upper class element with a smaller group. He's then in Ulster with two denominations and was brought into the class as the being element. Like Mount, is he suffering the consequence of being transplanted from one religious environment to another?
I think that's certainly a possibility coming from Munster initially. That might account for his hostility to Orangism. And he was prepared to stand up to people. It was Francis Ford, presumably one of the Fords of Seaford, who wrote to him in 1849 asking him to sign the petition on behalf of Roden, which he simply refused to do. So he was prepared to stand up for himself. And yes, he was a controversialist. I think he recognized this to some extent himself. I didn't go into his views on tithes, but he wrote a pamphlet on tithes in 1832, in which he admitted that the position he took would not appeal to anyone.
Although Thomas Drew was from Limerick,
yes,
just coming from Munster doesn't necessarily mean you're hostile to Oranges. So, any other questions? Yes.
Just wondering, Colin, you mentioned about the debate between the three Catholic clerics and the Hincks. Was that a common film in the 1920s?
Yeah, in the 1820s, there are a lot of these debates. This was the period of what's been called the Bible Wars or the Protestant Crusade now, and that's the title of Desmond Bowen's book. And there were a number of these debates between clergy of Church of Ireland and the Catholic Church, and I think maybe some between Presbyterians and Catholics as well. But this one was published in a volume of several hundred pages. It was a debate over 3 days.
It wasn't unique for Catholic and Protestants. I mean, debates between Cook and the Ulster Presbyterian in Belfast.
Sorry,
it's not the unique Catholic Protestant thing.
Yes.
It's not a disputation between Cook and the Scottish Voluntarist Presbyterian. And I think Tresham Graham's Greg at one point challenged Cook to a public debate. So Cook refused.
yes.
Yes.
Is part of his problem, though he definitely, you made it clear, he becomes an Anglican out of conviction. That's also linked in, I'm sure, to his progress through Trinity College. He's not going to progress to a degree even unless he does become an Anglican. But as part of his problem, some of the baggage he brings with him from his dissenting background, both his father and his mother are very thoroughgoing dissenting families. And some of the liberal kind of connections you're suggesting he had could be seen in that kind of context as baggage he's brought with it.
Oh, yes, I think he clearly had inherited his family's politics, even if he disavowed his family's religion. As I said earlier, there seems to be an estrangement from William at one point in the 1820s, but in 1840, William, the Unitarian minister brother, wrote to his father, Thomas Dix Hincks, about the 1840 sermon in Dublin Castle Chapel, that he didn't agree with the religious parts, but he agreed with the political parts. And it seems that they've been in contact at that stage. I do wonder what he thought was going to be his parents' eternal destination, because in that 1828 disputation, he referred to believing in the Athanasian Creed, which is a creed which declares that salvation is dependent on belief in the Trinity. The other thing I wonder about, which I think you may be able to answer, what form of baptism would non-Trinitarian ministers have used in the 1790s? And would Hincks have been baptized in the name of the Trinity?
It's possible that he was.
Yeah.
I think I asked this question of Theophilus Lindsay of someone studying Theophilus Lindsay, who was the first thoroughgoing Unitarian in London, and I was shown his version of the prayer book, which kept what we might call the Trinitarian reformers. So it's possible that he was, but without, couldn't say for sure.
Well, I know that F.D. Morris, one of the leading Church of England theologians in the 19th century, was the son of a Unitarian minister. But when he became an Anglican, he did not have to be rebaptized because his father, though a Unitarian, had used a Trinitarian formula in baptism. So possibly that was true of Hincks as well.
Questions online, Nick?
Yeah, we have one from Michael O'Connor. Do you want to unmute?
Hello, just two questions. The first is his really profound interest in, do we know anything of views on slavery on the Bible, or slavery more generally? And second question is whether he had any interaction with or meeting with Francois Champollion.
With whom?
Champollion.
No, he refers to Champollion in the letter of 1829 as being one of the people who'd started the study of Egyptology, but there was no contact that I know with between Champollion and Hincks, or indeed between Hincks and Thomas Young, who was the other leading pioneer. They were the people who cracked the Rosetta Stone hieroglyphics. As to slavery, yes, there is one letter he wrote in 1831 regarding an abolitionist who'd recently come to Belfast. Hincks expressed his personal opposition to slavery in that letter, but he denied that slavery was unbiblical because he believed it could be justified from the scriptures. And he also argued that slave owners ought to be compensated. His sister Hannah was a leading member in the Belfast Anti-Slavery Society, so that might have made relations between them difficult. But as I say, in that letter he said he was personally opposed, but he did not believe it could be regarded as unbiblical.
That's really helpful, thank you.
Okay, do we have other questions? Yes.
Was there any relationship between an Anglican clergyman's income and his relationship with the people of the parish?
Well, of course, the tithes were given by parishioners. Hincks seemed to have compounded or reached an arrangement for the tithes under the Gulbon Act of 1822, and that seems to have been what reduced his income. That tithes were later converted to a rent charge. I don't know if that in any way altered the way in which Hincks obtained his tithes, but in the reduction in income from nearly 800 to about 550 seems to have continued all the same, whether he was getting the tithes under 1822 or 1838. His position on tithes is a bit complicated. In 1822, he wrote a pamphlet in which he argued that tithes were an absolute right, whether the incumbent resided or not. By 1832, in the pamphlet I referred to earlier, he'd reached a position where he was pretty nervous about the situation in Ireland. He was worried about the tithe war. He objected to the use of coercion to obtain tithes. But he was also, despite his support for Catholic emancipation, he was worried about the effect potentially on the situation of Catholic members in the Commons. This was the year also of the Reform Act. He suggested that the Commons wouldn't in future be dominated by Irish Catholic members. So he suggested in that pamphlet that the whole tithe income should be handed over to the state. He expressed towards the end of the pamphlet the hope that it would be used for purposes of preaching the gospel, but he added in capital letters at the very end of the pamphlet that he hoped it would not be used for the support of the Catholic Church. I don't know about other income from parishioners. He may have, I'm not sure of the legal position whether clergy at that stage could charge for weddings or baptisms, but he did refer in one letter to most of his income coming almost exclusively from tithes. So that would have been the main financial connection between himself and his parishioners, or indeed the people of the parish, whether or not they were actually his flock.
Yes.
Sorry, it's really about clarification. I think somewhere in your lecture you mentioned that Church of Ireland bishops, you suggested that the income of Church of Ireland bishops should be reduced.
Yes.
Did you mention that there were 55?
Well, in that letter of November 1865, he calculated the total income of the then 12 bishops at 55,000.
Who provided that one?
I'm not sure of how episcopal income was obtained.
It wasn't tithes for that?
I don't think so. It's probably other provisions, but I'm not sure at this stage whether episcopal income is contrasted with the income of the rectors and other incumbents came from. But he wanted it to be reduced to 26,000 for 8 bishops, as opposed to 55,000 for 12.
That's a significant amount of money.
Yes, I mean the episcopal income had already been reduced under the 1833 Act. And the Irish bishoprics a lot of them were pretty valuable, particularly Armagh, Dublin, and Derry, and Clogher. But in that income, though it remained considerable, was reduced from the 1830s onwards.
I know you mentioned in the talk about the 15-year Bible being seen by critics as maybe an example of Mormonism. Was Mormonism a movement that was feared by many in Ulster this time? Or?
Well, I think he was probably referring to Mormonism. That was McElroy. Something new and strange, and again they regarded the revival as being new, strange, and unwelcome. Though the physical phenomena had been part of 18th century Methodism, but it had died out. I think Patrick.
Oh, Patrick, you have another question? Sorry.
Two minor ones. Well, first is where his family, Socinians or Arians?
Well, the terms seem to be used interchangeably at this point of the New Light Presbyterians. Don't know if Dr. Steers could.
I think his father was an Arian.
Yeah.
So, and some of his siblings
Yes.
would have described themselves as Unitarians.
Yeah. I haven't yet got around to reading William Bruce. Bruce wrote the Creed in an Arian. But I mean, was Bruce an Arian in the 4th century sense? Was Bruce an Arian in the sense that was used in the 4th century?
Yeah, I mean, this is where we get the idea from.
Yeah.
They would describe themselves as biblical Arians.
Yeah.
Second question is references to both Daniel and Egyptology in the 19th century context. My promise of belief and numerology. Are these already, does he take an interest in these, or are they already vanished?
No, he doesn't go into that sort of area, I don't think.
So if I could ask Colin, so the parish of Killyleagh is mostly, if not wholly, on the Dufferin estate.
Yes.
The holders of the Dufferin title, range from ultra Protestant in the 1830s through to the first Marquess, kind of Peelite conservative, moving towards Gladstonian liberal. That's an important relationship, presumably, for the rector, the relationship with the local landlord.
He presided over.
So how does that change over time?
He was certainly a guest of Dufferin at Clandeboy, and he thanked Dufferin for introducing him to Lord Carlisle in 1855. He was also annoyed about Dufferin over the deanery of Down because he thought Dufferin was trying to obtain that for his uncle. But then he presided over Dufferin's marriage in 1862 to one of the Hamiltons of Killyleagh Castle. But that's all I know at present about the relationship between the two. And Dufferin had an interest in Egyptology. He travelled in Egypt, which Hincks never did. He never left the British Isles.
We have another question online from John McDowell. You want to unmute?
Right, hello, Colin. As someone who was once Bishop of Clogher and is now Archbishop of Armagh, I can assure you that the income now is much less in comparative terms than it was in the middle of the 19th century. And also to say that very often bishops did derive income not just from tithe but directly from the rent of land, which was term land, which was their own. So I would say that's where the bulk of their income came from, not from tithe. But just to ask, you mentioned F.T. Morris a little earlier, and there are sort of clear parallels there in the sense of an early affection for the Tractarians and then a strong reaction against them, an interest in education like Morris. But also, is there any correspondence or any evidence of a connection with Archer Butler?
With
William Archer Butler?
No, none that I know of.
And with Morris?
No. There's no correspondence that I know of, nor indeed with J.H. Todd, the leading Irish high church. At least none that I'm aware of at this point.
Now, I'm doing a bit of work on Archer Butler, and I would have been interested in that. But in any case, thanks. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions online? No. Any other questions from the room? I might finish with just one more then, perhaps, Colin. So it must be, a very isolated existence. If you are and have aspirations to be one of the leading Egyptologists and Assyriologists in these islands, and you're stuck in Killyleagh and dependent on correspondence to maintain your connections, it's obviously intellectually very isolating. I mean, is there anything happening at the Royal Irish Academy or in Belfast Natural History and Philosophical Society that would suggest any intellectual engagement, any hinterland for Hincks?
Well,
traveling distance of where he is.
He'd become a member of the Royal Irish Academy as a young man, but seems to have resigned. I don't know why. He wrote a lot for the transactions as they then were of the Royal Irish Academy, but those contributions had to be read on his behalf by people who are actually members. As to his isolation, he often expressed the wish to get a parish in London. That never happened. He sometimes wrote, on a number of occasions, he wrote that he hoped that a chair might be created for him. That never happened. It is remarkable, I think, that he was able to achieve so much in the circumstances of relative geographical isolation and of an income which, although by 19th century standards was quite big, obviously was not big enough in his view, and may have well not been big enough to help with his researches. I get a sense from some of his letters that he was pretty depressed. At one stage, he actually thought about giving up scholarly work altogether. Though in fact, he continued right up to the end. He was able to visit London on only a few occasions, but he was able to get rubbings of inscriptions, which he could use for the decipherment. These are Assyrian inscriptions primarily, and some Egyptian. By the way, if there's any people here have read Middlemarch, and if you found the idea of a rural clergyman using research on Near Eastern subjects to defend the Bible, then I think you're thinking on the right lines. I think Hincks may have been the model for Corbyn. That's only a theory, but
okay, well, good to be followed up. Can we finish by thanking Colin for coming and presenting on his research on and if anyone would like to ask Colin any questions directly, there's a good opportunity to do so now. I'm just going to finish by thanking you all for coming online as well as in person, reminding you we do have another seminar next Monday at 4:30 in this room. Professor Finola O'Kane of University College Dublin will be speaking on the subject of sharp gradients, comparing the landscape design of 18th century Haiti, Saint-Domingue, Jamaica and Ireland, 1730 to 1830. So very much a kind of talking about her current project on comparing the kind of plantation infrastructures in the slave islands of the Caribbean and with the Irish plantation, Irish big house estates of the 18th century. So you're very welcome to come and join us next Monday at 4:30 for that. Thank you all for coming.